Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, I want to have a short kind of discussion on habits and what habits are, and typically what we see regular people do in kind of regular life. A habit, generally speaking, is a learned behavior, and oftentimes it becomes kind of like an automatic learned behavior. We typically divide them into what's normally called good habits or bad habits, or maybe neutral habits, right? The terminology aside here, whether it's good or bad, right? We can think about it as being like healthy habits or unhealthy habits. So usually a habit is formed through unconscious behavior, right? A lot of the times when we are practicing, we are actually trying to build a habit, right? Something that is a little bit more unconscious, right? We are training our autopilot, okay? Generally speaking, our autopilot is maybe normally what's called the default mode network in the brain. It could be something else though too, but it is kind of a subconscious thing that takes control, right? For most of the time. Our autopilot is usually in control most of the time, right? It actually takes quite a lot of energy to stay focused and present all the time. Evolutionarily speaking, it's not all that advantageous for us to be present and conscious all the time. This is why it's so challenging to cultivate mindfulness all the time, is because it takes a lot of energy to be conscious in the driver's seat, in my view. And so the autopilot kind of takes over because your brain wants to conserve energy. Your body is kind of in the business of conserving energy. Going back to prehistory, when food, water, and things were scarce, and you might have to run away from a predator or what have you, it makes sense that you want to conserve your energy. And we butt up against this quite a lot in the modern world, is because a lot of the times, assuming that we have access to good nutrition and proper sleep and proper shelter, assuming that, not everybody does, I understand that, but those things are a little bit more taken care of in the modern world, right? We probably should be able to, on average, get a pretty good uninterrupted sleep, hopefully. We have access to nutrition, right? Probably in larger quantities than what we had on average in prehistory. Hopefully, we're not in constant danger from predators. Again, I know that this is assuming a lot, so I don't want to negate anybody's experience, right? But in that sense, we don't necessarily have to conserve energy as much, and we can actually cultivate more of an awareness thing. But this is why we're kind of almost always working against our autopilot. The second that we start to feel confident in something, your autopilot takes over, and that's when we start making mistakes. And it doesn't consciously take over. We don't say, okay, you take over, autopilot. You got this, like, good enough. Usually it just kind of happens because it's very difficult to hold focus. And this is kind of a habit that we have. Staying conscious is quite challenging. It's uncomfortable sometimes. And in my view, if we're learning bad habits, typically they're happening unconsciously. It could have been learned behavior from a parent or a friend. It could be a trauma response. I understand that that is a whole other thing as well. But oftentimes it's just something that we did over and over again that formed into a negative habit or an unhealthy habit that is challenging to break. And if we have ever broken bad habits before, we'll know how challenging it is to break, because these things are automatic behaviors. They've been ingrained. The pathways in our brain have been so solidified that we do that almost every time a certain thing happens. And so breaking a bad habit requires us to be conscious of it to begin with. We have to be conscious that we have the bad habit. And anytime that we engage in the bad habit or negative habit, unhealthy habit, we have to recognize, hey, I'm doing that thing that I don't want to be doing anymore. And then we have to choose a different option. So this is something that mindfulness can really help facilitate. Because first of all, we have to become aware. We have to be constantly reminded when we have the urge to do that thing. In meditative circles or meditative classes or what have you, they often talk about widening the gap between stimulus and reaction, right? Action and reaction. Because a lot of people are unconsciously on autopilot reacting to stimulus, things that are happening around them or things that are happening to them. And through the practice of mindfulness and meditation and things, they say that that gap between stimulus and reaction can get a bit wider. And we can recognize, oh, I'm about to have an automatic response. Do I want to respond in that way? Or am I going to choose a different path? Now, oftentimes, the paths that we have available to us are paths that might not be obvious to us at first. But the more that we go into contemplation and things, we might be able to uncover that there are actually quite a lot of different paths that we can engage in. And so we can identify, this is happening, it's making me feel in a certain way, and it makes me want to react in this way, or go to this behavior, or what have you. And then we can decide what's a better course of action and choose that. This is related to cognitive behavioral therapy, which is kind of just a way of recognizing habitual behavior and choosing a replacement for that habitual behavior. So it's breaking bad habits and then forming new ones. Now, this only happens consciously. It only happens if we are able to recognize, I'm about to engage in that behavior, and then choose something else. Good habits, healthy habits, are usually not formed by accident, whereas bad habits often are. We want to kind of recognize that in ourselves. When it comes to our practice, when it comes to many things in life, our autopilot wants to be in control, right? And oftentimes the autopilot might not be making the best choices based on all of our past actions that have solidified into habits. And so if we want to build new habits, we need to identify them, become conscious of them, mindful when they are being triggered, and then choosing something else. And through mindful music practice, let's say, we can start to build good habits without first having to break bad habits. So this is kind of the goal, is to be able to be mindful enough in our practicing of music to not have to make bad habits and then have to break those bad habits and build good ones. We want to go directly to the source of making good habits, and that happens consciously. And it's okay that we get distracted. It's okay that our autopilot takes over. And usually in music, I see this as when somebody is repeating something over and over again, like practicing a certain phrase, and then they're playing it correctly 4 or 5 times in a row, but then the 6th time they start to make mistakes that they weren't before. The 7th time they start making mistakes that they weren't before. This is when we get maybe overconfident, and then our autopilot kicks in. And then the autopilot is not trained enough yet, right? Because if we're practicing something new, the autopilot wants to kick in right away, but it's not yet ready. We don't have the muscle memory. It hasn't built up yet, right? We haven't formed those pathways for you to get into a flow state with it. So oftentimes we will do something consciously once or twice, and then we'll try to play it at speed, at tempo, right? And kind of like not even thinking about it. Let's see if that worked. Let's see if I have muscle memory now. We're jumping to relying on muscle memory where none exists yet. The muscle memory isn't trained. So obviously we're probably going to be making mistakes. And then learning that as a habit, because the more that you repeat something over and over again, the more it becomes habit. This is why it's okay to make mistakes, right? I just want to say that it's okay to make a mistake. But if we make the same mistake twice or 3 times or more times, that's becoming a habit. Because your brain does not recognize what is correct. It remembers what you did. And if you play something incorrectly the same way 10 times and you play it right 1 time, you're going to probably more likely do the 10 incorrect times. Your consciousness knows if something is correct or not, because we probably are doing that, repeating until we get it correct. But really, for optimal practice, we want to play it correct each time to build a good habit. So we go slowly and we repeat small chunks, and we help our memory in that way, where we're not playing huge amounts of music all at once. And we want to get as close to the way that we want it to be played, slowly and accurately, as many times as we can. Because what a lot of people do is that they'll play something 10 times incorrectly, and then they'll play it once correctly, and they think, I got it, yes. Good, moving on. But your brain, as I said, doesn't remember what's correct. It remembers what you did. And if you played it 10 times incorrectly, your brain's going to remember to do that. And that is your muscle memory. So let's get more into our consciousness, into our self-awareness, slow things down, and build good habits before the bad habits form. But if we do form bad habits, we can always undo them by becoming conscious of them and replacing them with something else.